Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. Ukraine's President Zelensky says peace talks could be called positive, adding that his country will not slacken its defenses. As peace talks continue, fighting also continues with at least 12 people said to be killed by a Russian strike on a government office in Mykolaiv. Plus, London Cabby channels Blitz Spirit to deliver aid to Ukrainians. There are some signs of optimism from peace talks being held in Istanbul, Turkey. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the signals from the talks could be called positive. However, he adds that they did not drown out the explosions from Russian cells. In a late-night address, Mr. Zelensky also expressed caution about Russia's promise to sharply curtail military action in some areas and said Ukraine would not be easing off its defensive efforts. Russia and Ukraine have been holding peace negotiations in an Istanbul palace. Mr. Zelensky says Kiev saw no reason to believe in words from some Russian representatives. Earlier in the day, Russia had promised to scale down military operations around Ukrainian's capital and the north. Mr. Zelensky reiterated that for any peace deal to work, Russian troops would have to leave and there could be no compromise on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And as we've been reporting, Russia has said it will sharply scale back military activity around Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and the northern city of Chernobyl in the most tangible sign yet of progress towards a peace deal. Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin gave the undertaking after talks between delegations from the two countries in Istanbul. He says that in order to increase mutual trust and create the necessary conditions for further negotiations, as well as achieving the ultimate goal of agreeing and signing an agreement, a decision was made to radically, by a large margin, reduce military action in Kiev and Chernihiv. Although he did not refer to the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, where Russian forces are also conducting major offensives, but have struggled to make headway. Russia's chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, says this was one of two steps Moscow was taking to de-escalate the 34-day-old conflict. He said the other was that Russia would agree to a meeting between Presidents Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky to take place simultaneously if and when a peace treaty was initialed by their foreign ministers. Previously, Moscow had said that a presidential meeting could only take place at a later point. Well, for now, it doesn't appear the instructions to scale down attacks has gotten to the Russian army, because even as the talks progressed, fighting continued to rage. A Russian strike on a government office in Mykolaiv is reported to have killed at least 12 people. Heavy shelling has also been reported on the outskirts of the capital, Kiev. Explosions have been heard outside Kiev, where it is unclear whether they are coming from Ukrainian or Russian forces. The morning began with the wailing of air raid sirens, followed by loud booms on the outskirts. Many report the sounds of artillery rumbling from the edge of the city to the center. And in spite of the optimism from Ukraine on the peace talks and the Russian announcement of drastically reducing combat operations in two key areas to boost mutual trust, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he has not seen, quote, signs of real seriousness from Russia in pursuing peace after its invasion of Ukraine. He adds that Moscow should end its aggression now and pull its forces back. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says U.S. soldiers are liaising with Ukrainian troops in Poland, but not training them. U.S. and Ukrainian officials say that Russia is continuing to reposition forces away from Kiev, probably as part of an effort to refocus on the separatist breakaway regions in the east.
I have not seen anything that suggests that this is moving forward in an effective way, because Russia, at least we've not seen signs of real seriousness. But if Ukraine concludes that there is, that's good, and we support that. As to the stories about poisoning, I don't have any details on that. I've seen the reports. What I can say is that, of course, this raises concerns because Russia has a real track record. And you only have to go as far back as the poisonings in the UK, whether it's simply trying to regroup, given the heavy losses that it suffered. I don't know. So we're focused on what they do. I would add that if they somehow believe that an effort to subjugate only, in quotation marks, the eastern part of Ukraine and the southern part of Ukraine can succeed, then once again they are profoundly fooling themselves. We've seen the will and the determination of the Ukrainian people to determine their own future, not to have Russia or anyone else determine it for them.
Let's switch to the humanitarian aspect of this war, where urgently needed aid supplies have reached the embattled Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, and that's according to the United Nations. The spokesperson for the UN Humanitarian Coordinating Office, Jens Lorke, says relief has reached the city of Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine for thousands of people, amidst reports that people are facing life and death decisions on whether to leave Mariupol and elsewhere more than a month after the Russian invasion. To the south and other Ukrainian locations that have been encircled and pummeled by indiscriminate shelling, the International Committee of the Red Cross has warned that the crisis is deepening the level of death, destruction, and suffering. Briefing journalists in Geneva, the ICRC spokesperson, Evan Watson, reiterated serious concerns about civilians who have no safe means of escape and who have faced constant shelling while also lacking running water and other essentials.
Yesterday made its way into the hard-battered Kharkiv in northern Ukraine and safely delivered food rations, medical supplies and household items for thousands of people. There are UNICEF supplies for 6,000 people, UNHCR items for 500 households. That includes things such as solar lamps, tarpaulins and blankets. WFP food rations for 3,325 people for 2 weeks. WHO supplies to care for 10,000 primary healthcare patients for 3 months and supplies to treat trauma patients.
The humanitarian crisis is deepening in Ukraine. The level of death, destruction and suffering that we are witnessing and that is being inflicted on civilians is abhorrent and unacceptable. Today, civilians are taking life and death decisions to flee when there is no ceasefire or other agreements in place that would allow them to leave safely. Time is running out for civilians in Mariupol and in other frontline areas who have now gone for weeks with no humanitarian assistance.
Let's talk to Fadino, an immigration lawyer, an expert on migration matters. He joins us from the British capital, London. Good morning to you, Mr. Fadino. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Mr. Akeredolu. It's a pleasure.
There is, I'm hesitating to call it a glimmer of hope, it appears, because for the humanitarian situation to improve and for the migration to take on a fairly more straightforward hue, there has to be peace. And that's why I say there appears to be some glimmer of hope from the peace talks taking place in Istanbul, Turkey. Both sides are seemingly describing progress. Does that give you cause for, I don't know, cheer?
Good morning once again. The way I feel right now, especially to do with the current Russia-Ukraine war and the crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and the stress and problems this particular war is causing, and the track record of the Russians in the last 6 weeks of just bombing repeatedly, not caring about whether they're killing or maiming people. They've promised so many things in the past, particularly to do with the fact that they were not going to be invading Ukraine. They did, and this consistent bombing and sending missiles, destroying cities all over Ukraine has continued. So honestly, I would not really bait my breath really to do with the current promise that maybe there could be peace. They've destroyed nearly half of the whole of Ukraine, and for them now to be saying that they will be peace or that they are ready to actually negotiate for peace, as far as I'm concerned, it's neither here nor there at this point in time.
Let's turn to the humanitarian crisis, therefore. One of the things that had been reported earlier was that when the war started and people were trying to flee, there were a few stories from some of those fleeing which tended to point fingers at people being discriminated against in terms of getting support for their attempts to leave war-torn areas. And some of them, in fact, called it racism. They talked about being singled out of buses and being pulled off trains and all of that. Is this backed by humanitarian law?
No. The humanitarian law, as far as the 1951 UN Convention for Refugees is concerned, is very, very clear. You cannot discriminate against any individual, no matter the color of that person, whether the person is white, yellow, black, whatever color that person is. If we're in a war-torn situation, everybody should be treated equally. But what the evidence we've been seeing over the last 5-6 weeks to do with particularly Africans living in Ukraine, mainly students, medical students, and so many other students, but mainly medical students, professionals. It seems that the authorities, the Ukrainian authorities, and some humanitarian, charities, what they are doing is they are preventing Africans from entering buses, women, children, and there's clear evidence of this happening all over the world right now. So many videos being shown of Africans desperate to actually get out of Ukraine, but they are being discriminated against, and that is indeed against the UN Convention for the 1951 UN Convention for Refugees. You are not meant to be doing that at all. And I would want to actually call on the Nigerian government and so many other African governments to raise the game. They would have to step up, really, and declare and tell the world what it truly is. This is racism. This is discrimination against fellow human beings who, after all, have the right to be able to at least be treated as human beings. You cannot just push them aside and start telling Africans that no, we are not going to be taking you to a safe area or through the safe corridors, humanitarian corridors, that you're going to be left behind. There are so many of them who are so desperate right now, Africans, the students. Some of them are even going through trauma. They are going through so much stress, scared of anything, that anything could happen to them anytime. And the Ukrainian authorities they don't even care. They're in a war-torn area. But I would call on our governments to do more than what they're doing right now. It's not right, it's not proper, and it's not fair on these stranded students and professionals still in Ukraine.
When I spoke to you last, that was nearer the start of this, the UK program for Ukrainians, the UK Home Program for Ukrainians, was just getting started. In fact, I'm not 100% sure at that time it had in fact formally started, but that was quite a bit of time ago. Now, how is it working? Are you seeing Ukrainians now on the streets of London trying to settle into a new home, perhaps?
Yes, well, the program is in progress, really, no doubt. There are so many Ukrainians who have now applied for that leave based on what they should be doing online, making the applications. And so long as they could actually prove and show that they are Ukrainians, either in form of a passport or birth certificate, or whether you actually have members that are living in the UK, yes, you could now make the application. And I think it's been progressive at this point. I think well over about 20,000 people have been granted leave to enter already. One other thing that was not clear the last time we spoke was to do with how it would apply to family members. What has developed over the last 1 week is the case that if you are a family member, take for instance, if you're a family member of a Ukrainian living in the UK, or a person, even if you decide to actually apply and you have actually close family members, spouse, wife, and relatives, uncles, or whatever, and you could actually show that, you would be able to actually come into the UK. One other thing that I think could also be relevant to particularly Africans or foreigners is the fact that if you are married to a Ukrainian and that Ukrainian is fleeing war from Ukraine, you would, as the spouse of that very particular Ukrainian, also be able to apply for leave to relocate to a different country, because it still falls within that remit of a family member. So, I mean, the matter is progressing gradually, and hopefully they will get to a point where things are now running very, very smoothly.
Well, but all of this, if I understand what you explained the last time about this program, all of this is fairly temporary. This is not people relocating to the UK permanently. It's only until things stabilize in Ukraine, and then they'll be expected to return.
Yes, indeed. But as we stand right now concerning the matter with the Ukrainian crisis, we do not know when this war would end. Although we keep on people keep on saying that there's a possibility that it could end anytime soon, but I don't think so. But what people are being granted in the UK, and I want to believe that that's the same situation with so many other European countries. You are first of all allowed to come in for 6 months. Then you then extend that leave for at least 3 years. You'll be given that leave to remain and stay in the UK for 3 years, whatever the circumstances. Then after 3 years, depending on what the situation is in Ukraine, maybe that situation will be reviewed. And I suspect that the authorities are granting that limited leave of at least 3 years. The authorities are doing this because they are not too sure of where this war is going, whether it's going to be escalating to a point where it could be a bigger thing. Hence the reason why 3 years leave is being granted at this point.
But then, sadly, when we spoke about it the last time, especially in relation to what you had said earlier on, there is no such program for Africans and the like who were resident in Ukraine and have been affected by the war in similar circumstances as the Ukrainians themselves, particularly the students and so on, whose careers, academic pursuits and so on have been interrupted. There isn't any such provision, and it doesn't look as if there will be any time soon.
No, as far as the majority of Africans are concerned, that most of these rules and new policies to do with refugees would not apply to Africans. But I think one thing they could possibly do, there are some NGOs, some organizations, non-profit organizations who are looking at trying to help Africans to at least get out of that very particular war zone through safe corridors. I also read somewhere last week that there are some medical students who, if they could manage to move to Poland, there are some universities that are actually trying to at least accommodate them, for them to at least be able to continue with their studies in Poland. And I think in Hungary, I'm not too sure of Hungary, but I know Poland quite well, that they are giving the opportunity for some students, if they could continue with their medical studies in Poland, that could be possible. But generally, many African students and professionals, they are at the mercy of all these charities and organizations. They are not allowing many of them to stay in many of these countries. They will not be granted that leave to stay in the countries. Hence the reason why it's incumbent upon our governments to, bang that drum and, stress very clearly to the international community that, look, our African brothers and sisters are they are human beings after all, like just any other person who has been affected by this war. It's either you actually help the students or you do all what you can, to ensure that these students are moved to safe countries where they would not be discriminated against, where they will not be treated unfairly, like what they're actually going through right now. It's very, very unfair that Africans should be treated this way. And the irony of all this is that we have a situation where Russians are bombing Ukrainians to smithereens. And these same Ukrainians, are discriminated against Africans. It's so ironic that this could be happening in a situation where we are all human beings and we should be given the same human rights to be able to at least flee the war-torn area and be treated very fairly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Fadino, for your perspective and for your time on the program. As always, we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, sir. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Still ahead on the program, sick and vulnerable refugee children from the southeast region of Ukraine arrive in Poland. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. With Ukraine's farmers on the front line of the war, the United Nations food chief is warning that the crisis in that country is threatening to devastate the World Food Programme's efforts to feed some 125 million people globally because Ukraine had gone, quote, from the bread basket of the world to the bread lines. According to the World Food Programme's executive director, David Beasley, this crisis will have a global context impact beyond anything since World War II. Speaking to the 15-member UN Security Council, he said that 50% of the grain bought by the World Food Programme comes from Ukraine, and so there's much devastation going on with relations to the WFP's operations.
We were already, because of fuel prices, food pricing, shipping costs, beginning to cut rations for millions of children and families around the world in countries like, let's say, Yemen, where we had just cut 8 million people down to 50% rations, and now we're looking to go to 0 rations. Niger, Mali, Chad, and I could go on and on and on. So now we're talking about a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe, because Ukraine, from the bread basket of the world now to bread lines, we never would have dreamed anything like this would be possible. And it's not just decimating dynamically Ukraine in the region, but it will have global context impact beyond anything we've seen since World War II.
The World Food Programme is already feeding 138 million people in more than 80 countries, from Ethiopia to Afghanistan, South Sudan to Yemen, Nigeria to Syria. But now, Putin's war is driving up the costs of providing food assistance, and the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, estimates that as many as 13 million more people worldwide may be pushed into food insecurity as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Today's negotiations in Istanbul have demonstrated that Russia may be ready to make steps forward, although it is still a long way to a sustainable ceasefire and comprehensive de-escalation. The parties will continue consultations to prepare and agree on provisions of a treaty on the security guarantees for Ukraine, a mechanism of implementation of the ceasefire, withdrawal of forces and other armed formations, opening and safe functioning of humanitarian corridors on a permanent basis, as well as on the exchange of fallen soldiers and the release of prisoners of war and civilians.
A train carrying sick and vulnerable refugee children from southeast Ukraine has arrived in Poland. Several ambulances and groups of medics waited at the Przemysl-Aglonie train station to transport the children to nearby facilities. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the fighting has displaced more than 10 million people and forced nearly 4 million to flee abroad in Europe's biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And that's according to the UN Refugee Agency. Well, let's speak to someone in Poland. Our friend Dr. Michał Maciejewski is the head of Department Family Medicine at the Polish Mothers Hospital. Nice to see you, Doc. Good morning.
Nice to see you as well, and happy to be here.
The last time I spoke to you, you mentioned that one of the things that you had been trying to do, that is the health system in Poland, was trying to cope with all these groups of people with specialized needs. Between then and now, reports have emerged that some of those who left Ukraine for different parts of the world had left there, had arrived, and some of them had in fact tested positive to COVID-19. But because I remembered that you said Poland itself, before the war in Ukraine, was still battling with some element of COVID-19. Is this a complication in this situation?
Of course, it is a complication, but the amount of people sick from COVID is a much lesser problem than the amount of people that is going through the border. That's the biggest problem. The COVID is just a small part of the whole endeavor. The story of Ukrainian refugees is very sad, very bad. Some of them had to run with whatever they had in hands. So they don't have medicines, they don't have their own charts, they don't know even sometimes what they are sick from. So the COVID is a huge problem, and the amount of vaccinated in Ukraine is much lower than in Poland, which is also low, which is sad. But COVID is a tip of an iceberg here. We start to struggle with, let's say, normal diseases or a part of the pandemic. And if you put a lot of people in one place and few of them is sick, you will get sooner or later much more cases of the disease. So basically, COVID is a problem. And we start to deal with the huge burden for the whole system. That's the situation. We are trying to cope with that, and we still are accepting about 20 to 25,000 people a day through the border. As I checked last, it was about 2.4 million people in Poland by now. And most of them are housed in people's homes, okay? So a lot of people are just taking those refugees to their own homes. There is no way that we can cope with that amount of people without citizens to help. But we are working, the government hopefully is working, and it will be done soon on the more general way of helping the refugees. For now, they are accepted to get the personal identification numbers as Polish citizens, which is very helpful, both in finding work, housing, and in healthcare system, because till now, most of the things that we done was done on paper, which is not typical to Polish system for past 2 years, that we couldn't use the electronic charts and the electronic system because of a lack of the PESEL number, which is the name for that personal identification number in Poland. So that's going in a very good direction. A lot of people find places to, let's say, permanent stay. But remember that it's quite easy to accept somebody who you even don't know for weeks, but it's starting to be a problem for months or a year or a year and a half. And even if the war will finish tomorrow, we still need years to rebuild Ukraine. There are cities that are completely destroyed. And I'm saying that there is no stone over stone standing. Okay, so they don't have a place to come back to, even now. And with every day, the destruction is going to be worse. So it's not only fights, but also destructions of the infrastructure. A lot of hospitals was destroyed, a lot of schools was destroyed. So basically, those people will stay in Poland for months to come.
Longer.
And we have to longer. That's not a few weeks stay, not even a few months. I personally think that it's 2 years at least. Maybe not everybody, but most of them. But there is another big issue here, that if the war will exaggerate, if the Russian troops will go to the Western Ukraine, which is quite safe now, there is at least 8 million people, internal refugees from East Ukraine, went to West Ukraine, and they will be on our border within days if something will happen in that part of Ukraine. So there is no way to prepare for that. We are getting, again, about 20 to 25,000 people a day, and probably we will be able to sustain that for another month or two.
Let me interrupt you, Doc,
Yeah.
and ask this. The last time I spoke to you, I asked as well, I said, everybody knows that Poland has borne the brunt of this refugee crisis, the movement, the humanitarian movement, and all of that. And I asked then, was the country able to get any kind of help, either by way of funds or personnel or something, from the EU or from the UN or from any of the other stakeholders or participants in this crisis to cushion the effect? That's number one. Number two, family medicine, even at the best of times, is a very complicated thing. And then now you have all these groups of people, little children, their mothers, young, old, people with specialized needs. And Poland's population, in terms of doctors, has not increased in the last 1 month or 6 weeks. No. So how is the health system coping with all this?
To answer the second question first, is that we are having another problem because we are opening after COVID. So a lot of patients that were hesitating to come to their doctors are coming now. So we have double problem here. And we are trying to do our best to give extra hours for the refugees, not to, let's say, take refugees as patients instead of our own, but extra. So that's the part of the answer, but that's possible for weeks, again, not months, not years. So we are, the government is doing everything they can to put Ukrainian professionals that are also refugees, there are doctors among them, to help to dissolve that problem. So there is a way to get the diploma from Ukraine accepted in Poland in quite reasonable time. So that's part of the answer. As for the first question, the money and personnel hopefully is coming, and there are the decision we made that Poland will receive a lot of extra financing, but still not getting it. And I didn't heard anything about major movements of personnel to help with to cope with the refugees. So basically, at that particular moment, we are more or less alone with the problem. And I'm not saying that it's because of someone is not doing their jobs. Actually, they are, but it takes time, and it's just 30 days before after the start of the war. So even the bigger the institution is, the longer that it takes to actually get to the moment that they can pay the money or help with the personnel. I know that some countries are decided to accept some of the refugees from Poland or through Poland, and that's happening. Germany is taking some of the refugees. I know that after the visit of the American president, also they decided to accept even, I think, 100,000 people, but that's in coming months or weeks. At that moment, we are more or less alone with the problem. Everybody wants to help, but it takes time.
Dr. Mikhail Matyacek, again, it's a grim situation. One only hopes that the peace talks ongoing in Istanbul, Turkey, will reach some sort of resolution, a positive resolution for us to end this crisis. Thank you so much for your time. Please continue to stay safe and good luck. Good luck. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hopes next time will be a better conditions for it. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you so very much. Workers at the Chernobyl nuclear disaster site say Russian soldiers who seized the site drove their armored vehicles without radiation protection through a highly toxic zone called the Red Forest, kicking up clouds of radioactive dust. The two sources say soldiers in the convoy did not use any anti-radiation gear. The second Chernobyl employee says that was suicidal for the soldiers because the radioactive dust they inhaled was likely to cause internal radiation in their bodies. Ukraine's State Nuclear Inspectorate said on February 25th that there had been an increase in radiation levels at Chernobyl as a result of heavy military vehicles disturbing the soil. But until now, details of exactly what happened had not emerged. The director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development's Nuclear Safety Department, Balthazar Lindo, describes Russian troops' actions in the area as reckless.
In the first few days, a spike in radiation that is very likely due to the transport of heavy military equipment. So that gives you an indication that these troops do not know what they're doing and behaving recklessly. The behavior of the troops continues as they have shown in the past. Of course, there's a huge danger for severe accidents that could affect the region, and it would be a disaster.
Let's talk some business. Oil prices clawed back heavy losses today amidst tight supply and growing prospects of new Western sanctions against Russia, even as signs of progress emerged from peace talks between Moscow and Kiev. Brent crude futures touched a high of $112.78 shortly after opening and were up 86 cents, reversing a 2% loss in previous sessions. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures gained 82 cents to $105.06 a barrel, erasing a 1.6% drop yesterday. The market had seen a sharp sell-off in the previous session after Russia promised to scale down military operations around Kiev, but reports of attacks continued. And meanwhile, the United States and its allies planned new sanctions on more sectors of Russia's economy that are critical to sustaining its invasion of Ukraine, including military supply chains. Ini John McQuarrie, as always, joins me at this time on a Russian invasion. Ini, the ruble, before we come to oil prices, the ruble is up 10%.
10%, yes, because a whole lot of things. The first is that the peace talks we just talked about in Turkey gave people hope. You know, so that's one. So there was a bit of positive sentiment towards the ruble. And then the other one is that there's been a decrease in demand for foreign currency, you know, with all of the sanctions and the closing up and all of that. So there's been a reduction. And of course, because the competition is now reduced when it comes to demand, then the ruble is popping up. And, you know, we discussed some of those things, the requests for ruble, for gas and all of that. Some of those things have also helped to pop up the value of the ruble. And also, no more imports. So, I mean, what are people using the dollar for? So you can hardly get dollar. And then the Moscow Stock Exchange that opened, when people request to be paid in dollar, then they have to pay a commission of 12%. So there's so many little things that the Russian government
are put in place to kind of get.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned the rubles for gas thing. There's a deadline on that now.
Starts tomorrow. Actually, President Putin has said from tomorrow, if you want to buy Russian gas, you pay with ruble. So now...
so that would also probably feed into the fact that the ruble is gaining.
Yes, yes, of course. That's also part of the sentiment. So there are so many conversations around this. The first is the issue of the contract. A long-term contract has been signed before now. You know, of course, the ruble was not a part of it. So how...
It's a breach of that contract.
It's a breach of the contract. But some people say that, well, the market belongs to the sellers. So if the European countries, Germany especially, if they need energy, they need heat, they need power, then what will they do? They are kind of caught in between now, you know. So it's a dire situation for European countries, because even if they wanted to, which will also have legal implications because of the contract that have already been signed,
yes.
Where will they get the ruble from? You know, they can hardly get it, and you know, even those who have
to go to the Russians.
Going to Russia. Who's going into Russia at this time? There's restriction everywhere.
There's sanctions.
There's no
also.
airline. There are sanctions. No airlines are going there. You know, the SWIFT system has been they've been shut out of it, so you can't even get it there. Where do you want to get the ruble from? So it's a tight one for the European.
Earlier on, about 2 weeks ago, you and I discussed this. The second tranche of the payment of funds that Russia owes.
Which is more than the first one. The first one was $117 million.
This one is 2.2.
$2.2 billion, and it's due on Monday.
Well, I remember that you did say how the Russians paid the 117, and that if that same method is adopted this time around, the West might have no choice but to allow the payment to go through.
So I think the Russians are thinking of things differently now. So they've made an offer to local investors. You know, these are basically investors, people who bought bond, you know, belonging to the country. They've made an offer to local investors that between yesterday and today, they should make their interest known if they want to be paid in rubles. That is those in Russia. So if you're an investor, if you invested in that bond and you live in Russia, then you could get paid between...
In full?
In full, yes. Because on Monday, the uncertainty is like that. Right. You don't know if they're going to give the order, because, I mean, people have said that Russia has already been sanctioned, so there's no motivation for them to actually stick to paying their debts and all that. What else will you do to a man who is fallen? You know, so if they decide, well, we don't care, we're already sanctioned anyway, we're not going to, you know, give any order. After all, you are frozen our money and all that.
Right.
Or if the U.S. even decide, even if they give the order, then we're not going to obey it, then, you know, investors are now left in a tight corner, in a dilemma. They can't access their money, they can't access the capital, not to mention the interest. So, especially now that Russia is saying, if you're a local investor, you have about 2 days to make your interest on, and we will pay you, but we'll pay you in rubles. So we don't know what their plan is for Monday, which is when...
I guess some of this is also...
yeah, but you know, there's also another interesting part, although that one is still in talks, that says that from May, the United States Treasury may not be able to action on an order on their frozen accounts.
Assets, right.
Yeah, may not be able to. So, but that's still in talk. So if that comes out to be real, so even if they can action on this one, they have another one.
They have another one due.
Yeah, they have another one, I think the first part of next year, much more bigger amount. Now, if that is due, then even if they give the order, the U.S. may not be able to action on it, and then investors will just lose out.
Wow. A lot to analyze, a lot to take a look at its impact. Ini, thank you so much.
Thank you.
As always, Ini John McQuarrie of our business desk. There'll be more of that on Business Morning and Business Incorporated, where Ini herself and Laddie Williams will be on. Still to come, International Atomic Energy Agency is on ground in Ukraine to assist safe and secure operations of its nuclear facilities. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, says he would lead an IAEA mission to Ukraine to assist in the safe and secure operation of its nuclear facilities. Reading the statement to reporters in New York, a UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric says the IEA mission arrived in Ukraine yesterday. According to him, the Secretary General is supporting the IAEA's efforts and calls for personnel in Ukraine to be granted safe and unfettered access to all nuclear facilities.
The Secretary General spoke yesterday with Director General of the IAEA. The Director General advised the Secretary General that he would lead an IAEA mission to Ukraine to assist in the safe and secure operations of Ukraine's nuclear facilities. That mission arrived today in Ukraine. The Secretary General reiterated his strong support for the IAEA's efforts and called for IAEA personnel in Ukraine to be granted safe and unfettered access to all nuclear facilities. Their important work should not be interfered with. An accident at a nuclear plant would be a health and environmental catastrophe. All efforts must be taken to avoid this disastrous outcome.
The United Kingdom has ordered its first ever detention of a super yacht in British waters. The British government says the £38 million yacht named Fee is owned by an unnamed Russian businessman, but that its ownership is deliberately well hidden. Transport Secretary Grant Sharp says the move is a clear and stark warning to Mr. Putin and his allies. The United Kingdom has already introduced a raft of sanctions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We have held this ship, which we now know belongs to a Russian oligarch, because we're very clear we cannot have any benefit to these oligarchs with close connections to Putin whilst that terrible war is going on in Ukraine and so many people are suffering. Yes, at the moment the individual's not sanctioned, but we know that the connection is there. I should say the ship was deliberately masked in very, very complex ownership structure, as if to deliberately try to deny the reality of it. Thanks to the work of the National Crime Agency and others, we tracked it down. We now know the connection. The ship won't be going anywhere for the time being, and that's because we take what Putin is doing in Ukraine incredibly serious. And people who have benefited from his regime cannot benefit from sailing around.
Taking some sports news, as the numbers of refugees reach 4 million out of Ukraine, the United Nations Refugee Agency and the World Food Programme have launched the Football for Ukraine Emergency Appeal. 6 leading soccer players, 3 of whom are former refugees, are fronting a joint appeal with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency and the World Food Programme to raise funds to help refugees who have fled their homes and displaced people inside Ukraine. The appeal includes players from across the Premier League, Bundesliga and Division 1 Feminine. The 3 players with a refugee background are Bayern Munich's Alphonso Davies, Mahmoud Dahoud of Borussia Dortmund, who was the first Syrian refugee to play in the Bundesliga, and Everton FC goalkeeper Asmir Begovic, who was forced to flee his home in Bosnia-Herzegovina. They are joined by Lucy Bronze, Ada Hegerberg and Juan Mata. The global appeal, Football for Ukraine, comes at a time when almost a quarter of the country's population have been forced from their homes since Russia invaded its neighbor on February the 24th. Ukrainian tennis star Elina Svitolina has announced that she's taking a break from the sport due to mental and physical exhaustion coupled with the war in her homeland. She says her compatriots' resistance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine had encouraged her to play through back pain, but said she could no longer handle it. The former world number 3 has won 16 WTA titles, with the most recent being in 2021 in Chicago. She lost her Indian Wells opener against 122 ranked Harriet Dart of Britain and pulled out of the Miami Open, which is currently underway. And moved by footage of a Ukrainian father bidding a tearful farewell to his family, London taxi driver Matt Westfall felt compelled to do something to help those fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. Westfall contacted one of his friends and they got a group of fellow black cab drivers together with the aim of ferrying escaping Ukrainians to wherever they need to go. while they also raised about £10,000 for aid from various taxi organizations and a crowdfunding service. Last week, the group of 6 London black cabs, another car and a van then set off on the 11-hour trip to Poland, with the convoy attracting cheers and waves as it made its way through Europe. They dropped off the aid, which included sanitary products, baby food and nappies, and then started on the mission to take those who needed lifts to reach friends and family.
Evening, Alex. You want to film in there? Good old Alex there. To unload in there.
I was watching the TV one night and I see a man in his mid-30s with his wife and child, and all 3 of them were sobbing. It really did grab my attention, not in a nice way, because it quite upset me. We're renowned, allegedly renowned to be the best taxi drivers in the world at getting people from A to B. So my idea was, OK, let's go out there. We got a group of drivers together with no time at all. We had about £10,000 worth of aid, if you want to quantify it in pound notes. And for us, it was just like, off we go. And we left Harwich 8 o'clock on Saturday evening. We went up through Holland, through Germany, into Poland. So we spent the night, Sunday night in Poland, in Warsaw. In the morning, we got up at 6:30, ready for a set-off at 7:30 to a place called Lublin.
People showing humanity, emotion, sentiments, and the spirit of giving. That's where we end the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. I'm Ladi Akeredoluwale. As usual, there's an update at 5 o'clock. Do join us for that. But do have yourselves a very pleasant day ahead.